It's an honor to be your moderator for Panel 7 of this 2020 G20 Interfaith Forum. Our theme is challenging at any given point in time, ever more so, of course, in a time of pandemic. The description and the guiding questions have been available in the general agenda program of this conference, and so you will find it hopefully on the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. But in a nutshell, the description says that the values focus of education includes inclusion and religious literacy, takes on increasing importance, of course, in the COVID-19 era. And the next sentence is particularly important because it goes much more deeper than the theme itself. A priority is to address school systems that present manipulative discourses and narratives portraying religions, cultures, cosmogonies, and or worldviews, and I should add also different national ideologies, as antagonistic and irreconcilable. Religious inclusiveness and non-discrimination education are priorities for policymakers, but also for religious communities. Promoting critical thinking and positive images of the other in school curricula is a key tool for conflict prevention and promoting social cohesion. The four guiding questions, which will be more or less also the order in which the speakers will present their contributions, are the following. First, what are the priorities and needs in education policy that promise to encourage inclusion and religious and cultural diversity? The second question is, what are examples of inclusive approaches engaging religious and community leaders in developing curricula and building capacity of teachers? The third question is, what approaches can help improve social integration, intercommunal harmony, and respect for religious and cultural differences in schools that can be scaled up to the policy level? Finally, the fourth question is, what are priorities for G20 leaders for education as part of the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis? So today what we'll have is, we realize that several speakers have already spoken about the ways in which the pandemic has ignited several other kinds of crises, and education is, of course, among them. These different crises often exacerbate fault lines and disparities and injustices within humanity worldwide, as well as in relation to the resources of our planet Earth. The field of education as a whole is equally affected in its multiple forms in both formal and non-formal settings, public and private schools and universities, and a broad range of continuing education and capacity building trainings. New virtual spaces only add to the complexity of our challenges. Many examples have already surfaced in prior presentations, especially earlier this morning. Concrete examples were given of how COVID-19 is affecting billions of children and youth worldwide, in fact, the majority of the human population on this planet. What we find is that the list is very long of the different kinds of ways in which these crises are affecting the very fabric of our societies. And in different ways, education must aim to decrease ignorance through greater and more inclusive intercultural and interreligious dialogue in all sectors of society. This panel therefore aims to address just how to go about addressing these numerous challenges through both concrete national, international, and transnational examples of good practices, as well as through concrete policy recommendations that will hopefully help decision makers in G20 ministries of education in particular, but all the others as well. And of course, hopefully, several of you will also bring out some critical elements to the challenges we're facing. The present panel will add in the direction of policymaking in particular, building on many efforts, both within the United Nations, especially around its SDG number 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. UNESCO, but also the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, among many other international organizations and international NGOs, have easily accessible online resources describing the current educational crisis. So, we shall now hear more from our speakers about some of these important endeavors to which religious, spiritual, and committed actors and leaders from all nonviolent worldviews contribute their own perspectives as well as human, material, and immaterial resources. As a moderator, it is therefore my honor to introduce this panel, which is composed of 9 experts in the field of education. They bring a rich, on-the-ground set of varied experiences, as well as deep theoretical knowledge, covering both formal and non-formal educational contexts in different parts of the world. I shall introduce each speaker immediately prior to their respective brief presentations. As each speaker begins, in addition to their names and official title appearing on the screen, you will find a small bio about them in the side chat space. All listeners are invited to contribute brief questions and comments in that space throughout the duration of our panel. After the 9 initial presentations that address the 4 guiding questions, part 2 of our panel will allow for time for our speakers to dialogue with each other. Finally, in part 3 of our panel, the last 30 minutes or so will be focused on responding to as many questions taken from the chat space as time will allow us to address. So, allow me now to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Chateau-Gill. She's a research fellow at the Hermès Foundation for Peace and a visiting fellow at the School of Education at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. Again, for more biographical information, look at your right-hand side chat space. In particular, I welcome Dr. Gill because she has led a consultation process at the request of the G20 Interfaith Forum organization to help put in place more solid recommendations for this Interfaith Forum. And so we all look forward to hearing more about the results of this consultation process. Dr. Gill, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrice, and greetings to all. It's such a pleasure for me to be taking part in this distinguished panel, and my sincere gratitude goes to the organizers for creating such an important space at the G20 Interfaith Forum for a most timely dialogue about education. Let me begin by recalling 2 aspirations that brought us together. One is this year's G20 presidency agenda, which calls on G20 leaders to empower people, pave the way for a better future for all. Hence the theme, realizing opportunities of 21st century for all. The other is the raison d'être of G20 Interfaith Forum. As already highlighted on day 1, the forum offers a platform where rich ideas and values-based actions from world's religious, faith, and interfaith communities contribute to what Patrice just mentioned, the global agendas are heard and understood. Indeed, precisely under these aspirations and in collaboration with the Hermès Foundation for Peace, the G20 Interfaith Forum launched an education task force consisting of education experts from major global organizations such as Aga Khan Global Network, Arigato International, Dream a Dream India, Global Center for Pluralism, and Plan C Culture and Cohesion. Like Patrice said, I had the honor of facilitating the task force research that explored precisely the intersection between interfaith organization, interfaith communities, educational initiative on the one side, and the relevant UN SDG, especially 3 and 4, Patrice mentioned, namely promoting health and well-being, quality and equality of education. And what has brought to light in that research is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, interfaith organizations in many settings have been empowering local communities to close the gaps resulted from school closures, lack of public services due to lockdown and isolation. They also provided practical support to address the acute social, emotional, and spiritual needs of children and young people at this very difficult time. But what else have we learned from this research in terms of the priorities in education policy that encourage what Patrice talked about, inclusion and diversity, which is the focus of this panel's dialogue? I will briefly mention 3 points emerging from our research, which I believe are particularly innovative and also pertinent to this panel's interest. First, from an interfaith perspective, education inclusion is more than ensuring access to schooling. Many interfaith educational programs have conceived inclusion as, above all, the nurturing of the whole child, the supporting every child's well-being in all dimensions of their development: physical, social, emotional, intellectual, moral, cultural, and spiritual. Second, an interfaith perspective, especially through the lenses of love, compassion, respect, and humility, tend to advocate a view that human diversity is to be celebrated, and that presence of difference in the educational environments can serve to enrich our pedagogical practice and encourage educators to be more sensitive to the evolving well-being and learning needs of all students. And the third point emerging from the research is that an interfaith approach tends to demonstrate that embracing inclusion and diversity must be an integral endeavor. That is to say, that these must not be treated as isolated gestures or add-ons. Instead, inclusion and diversity must be a whole system process where the empowerment of educators is a key. So based on these insights, the G20 Interfaith Forum Education Task Force were able to develop an education policy brief for the consideration of the G20 leaders. You find this on our website. 3 policy priorities are highlighted. And you may have already guessed, advancing the well-being of every child as a core aim of education, ensuring active participation for all in inclusive learning environment, aligning teachers' professional learning and professional development with a well-being and inclusive agenda. And their illustrative practice, especially coming to the fore from the interfaith communities and organizations, including, for instance, interfaith curriculum, interfaith interreligious dialogue, interreligious literacy, relational pedagogy, democratic participation of young people, actively engaging students at the margin, empowering of girls, dialogic and collaborative classrooms, and also connecting teaching and learning to students' lived realities with a view of transforming that. To conclude, these interfaith perspectives really prompt us to realize that education already holds the cure of the widespread of social malaise. Hence, it's not an exaggeration to propose that the vaccine to end the hidden pandemic, i.e. the prevailing social inequality and injustice that has plagued humanity for so long, is precisely to be found in our education system, only if it is inclusive, human-centered, caring, only if it aims to nurture the well-being of all and realize the opportunity for all. That is the aspiration of this year's G20 agenda. As John Dewey cautioned, unless we do so, we will rob our children of their tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chateaugill. I retain in particularly sort of this image of inclusion and diversity needing to be an inclusive whole system. And of course, the 3 policy briefs are important and most valuable. So thank you for your leadership and all of the participants who did participate in earlier sets of meetings throughout the summer to make these so clearly available to policymakers of the G20 and beyond. I'd like now to turn to our next speaker. It's Dr. Fahad bin Sultan al-Sultan, who is based in Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Sultan, and he is the executive director of a wonderful NGO called Salam for Cultural Communication. The floor is yours, Dr. Sultan, who will be speaking in Arabic. So be ready to switch to English for those who may not understand Arabic. شكرا أهلا وسهلا وتفضلوا.
Thank you very much, my dear friend, Professor Patrice Brodeur. And I thank you very much for this introduction. First of all, I would like to welcome everybody here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, even though this welcome is only virtual. As a person from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I really hoped that this event would be able to be held on the ground of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but this pandemic has prevented it. But inshallah, so God willing, we look forward for future events and for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia reaching its hands to everybody, to welcome everybody in the future. I am very happy and honored that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is hosting the G20 summit this year, and we are hoping, so God willing, inshallah, that it will yield very positive results for all people on earth. Truthfully, this conference that will be held, which I think is like a small parliament that convenes all faiths of the faith spectrum and all from the academic field. And I hope that a part of our recommendations from this forum will be shown to the policy makers, because it is a benchmark. This forum is a benchmark for coexistence and tolerance and intercultural and interreligious dialogue. Also, I would like to profess my profound gratitude and appreciation for the King Abdullah bin Abdul Aziz International Center, KAICID, represented by its Secretary General, His Excellency Faisal bin Abdul Muammar, and to all the team members and to all partners, and also, of course, to thank the Program for Cultural Understanding in Saudi Arabia. And we have drawn a lot from their experience in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we hope, so God willing, that this cooperation and collaboration still exists in the future. Now, on to education and culture and religion. I would like to highlight the situation in the Arab world. As you know, that the Arab region is in dire need to consolidate the principles of coexistence and diversity and social inclusion. The Arab region has suffered a lot of perils in the last few decades, like conflicts and racism and discrimination, and a lot of these things that have reflected in a very grave way in our Arab countries and affected the development and affected a lot of sectors of the society. So there is a belief today or conviction today on the level of the Arab world that coexistence, tolerance, the acceptance of cultural and religious diversity has become a necessity and has become a key factor. The problem that we are facing today, or the question that we can ask ourselves, are the educational institutions in general, and especially in the Arab region, are they capable to fulfilling this very important role, which is the education of the young generation on the basis of principles of coexistence and tolerance and diversity? And I believe, taking in consideration the situation in the Arab world, that education is not independent in itself, but rather it is interactive with its environment, with its culture, with its society. And as everybody knows, we have the philosophical issue: is education in schools able to change society, or does the society form the educational system? And specifically for the Arab region, I believe that schools are the result of the cultural and political and religious reality that we are living. And thus, I believe that our main mission, aside of educational reforms, is raising awareness on the policy level and in the political and cultural and religious level. For instance, religious leaders play a major role in formulating the stereotypical thinking in societies, especially also in schools. So it is true that we need key reforms in the structure of the educational system, but still I stress that we need a sort of collaboration and cooperation between the educational organizations and the organizations of the civil society in a greater degree. So, educating children and pupils isn't solely the mission of schools, and nowadays a teacher is not all knowing anymore. Now there are a lot of platforms and challenges and channels, there are a lot of platforms and channels on social media that take also part. So we have also to discuss the influence of these new technologies, which are more influential or becoming more and more influential in awareness forming for pupils. And so we need more collaboration between the diverse organizations, which will be the path to success in reforming the educational system. Without this collaboration, these children and young peoples will have a lot of controversial messages being delivered to them. So we cannot fully foster the message of tolerance and coexistence and consolidate the principles of good education in schools and still allow for these pupils to go out into the world and receive false information. So I believe, especially in developing countries and in our Arab world in specific, that the educational system has these challenges. I would like to highlight another challenge we are facing regarding the cultural diversity and inclusion, which is the discussion about identity and global citizenship. So we find a sort of suspicion or a sort of problematic view about these concepts in the Arab world. A lot of people in the Arab world believe that the concept of global citizenship poses a threat to their identity, to their cultural, to their national identity. Define it and stress on the principles of humanity which should be or are a part of our reality in the Arab and Muslim world. And this dimension, in my belief, is very important so I participated in a lot of conferences held by UNESCO and the KIC Dialogue Center on Global Citizenship. And we have talked about the common values of global citizenship. And so the question is, are they the same as the principles of globalization and the prevailing systems in the world? So that was always the question that was risen that was raised in those conferences. So there are a lot of problems in understanding these concepts, and we have to raise awareness that these concepts have to do with elevating all the human principles, and that the aim of these concepts is to have human beings living together and coexisting together. And I believe that the Arab region is one of the most diverse regions when it comes to different ethnicities and different religions. There is great diversity actually in the Arab world, which is why we are called upon today highly to celebrate this diversity and to let education play a major role in complementing and fostering this plurality, this diversity, and highlighting this diversity of religions, ethnicities, and groups. These are the key necessities that we need in the Arab world. I would like to conclude here, Dr. Patrice, and I hope we can take part in the discussion later. Thank you.
Shukran jazilan, Dr. Sultan. Many thanks. It's important to bring your perspective as a host, and we take this opportunity, of course, to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for helping as part of the consortium of 4 organizations to host the 2020 G20 Interfaith Forum this year, and especially for the ability to switch to a whole online mode a few months before the event due to the pandemic. So thank you for doing that and for being so generous and hospitable from a distance in wonderful ways. And so I'd like to also point out that you raise a really important element, which is the often popular reactions in some circles to the notion of global citizenship, and understanding that as we think about our common humanity, how do we balance that common humanity identity with our other more particular religious, national, ethnicity, language identities, and so on and so forth. So thank you for bringing this out. It's important, and I hope we can continue discussing this point in our dialogue later on. I now turn to our third speaker, Reverend Professor Fadi Dao, who is the chairman and the CEO of the Adyan Foundation, a really important international NGO based in Beirut, in Lebanon. And so the floor is yours, Father Dao.
Thank you, Professor Broder. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to contribute to this G20 Interfaith Forum. That is by itself, it's a sign how much today our humanity needs to gather its forces and to face the challenges as one community, and especially when it comes to social cohesion, to living together in peace, where education plays a major role, and more specifically when we speak about education on inclusivity and on cultural and religious literacy. So my brief presentation will be in 4 points. First, each of these points will be addressing one of the categories, I would say, of the decision makers or stakeholders related to this challenging issue of education on inclusivity and cultural and religious diversity. The fourth one will be more practical, presenting very briefly also an experience that we led as Adyan Foundation in Lebanon. And we implemented this experience with the religious communities here and the government. Let me straightforward start by saying my first point is related to the international community of decision makers in relation to education, and all those who have an influential role or capacity to influence decision making on the global level in relation to education. It's about international relations, is about this type of forum that we are having today, or international experts also who have key role in different international platforms. On this level, I think we all need to advocate more and more to make cultural and religious literacy an educational right for every child, which is not yet the situation. We are very far from this. I was very pleased to hear I would say, realistic criticism that Dr. As-Sultan just presented to us, especially in the Arab region, for example. So we still have an advocacy work to do on the international level, and including, I think, to contribute in redefining and continuously updating the definition of what does it mean quality education in SDG 4, and more specifically SDG 4.7, when we speak about education on diversity, on human rights, on global citizenship, on human solidarity. So on this level, I think we need to join our forces to make from cultural and religious literacy an educational right for each child. And I hope that this forum would contribute in this direction. My second point is about the level of the government. So in each country, the decision makers, the policy makers on the governmental level, I think we need to do lots of work with this level. First of all, before introducing education on inclusivity and cultural and religious literacy, is to ensure that education is free from discrimination. And here also, I would like to be very realistic as a previous speaker, saying that we still have lots of work to do, starting from the Arab region, but even globally. We know that more than half of the states in the world sponsor, in a way or another, either a religion or an ideology or a kind of strong nationalism that is exclusive to other cultures or nationalities. So still lots of work to be done in policy making with governments to ensure that having inclusive education requires also having cultural governance and inclusive governance. And this is, I think, a huge challenge that is not only our responsibilities as experts, as academics, as civil society, but also it is really the responsibility of the governments themselves and all the international organizations to go towards more, I would say, cultural and inclusive governance on the governmental level that make a space for more diversity within the society and especially in educational systems. My third point is related to more directly to the educational community and more specifically to the experts and senior experts on the global level who are on a daily basis contributing in the development of educational theories and approaches and methodologies, especially when it comes to cultural and religious diversity and to have inclusive education. And here, I call all my fellow experts to collaborate more and more together to develop a concept of cultural and religious literacy that is based on an interreligious experience, making from education a positive interreligious and interhuman and intercultural experience where children, and not only children, because I'm speaking about education and not in my mind, I'm not having only the K-12 education, the school level education, but also in universities, non-formal education, informal education, and civil society, and so on. All these forms of education, I think, should be able to develop an approach for cultural and religious literacy and inclusive education that is by itself an interreligious and intercultural experience, where children or adult people learn to build positive relations among each other and learn to discover the richness of our humanity and the richness of diversity in our humanity through each other and from each other. I think lots of programs, I know KC, many other organizations, my foundation, Adyan, and so others in the world are developing many programs in this field. We need to do more, and we need also, based on this program, to develop the theory of cultural and religious literacy as an interreligious and intercultural experience, and not only as a knowledge. And finally, I will end with this last point, where it is more related to the religious leadership responsibles and religious communities, because this is also another challenge where communities in many situations fear each other and fear, in fact, that their pupils and their members, their fellows, fear that they would be exposed to other religions, to other knowledge. And this is still challenging on the theological level and on the educational level within the religious communities. So we have lots of work to do with religious communities to ensure that with them, that religion is presenting the best face of our humanity, and not religion is nurturing fear from other, and suspicion and hate toward other. What we did in 2 wars in Lebanon, we worked on an experience the last years that brought all the religious communities together, all the officially recognized religious communities in Lebanon together to work on an educational program, not about the definition of religions and the whole dogmatic aspects of religion. We started just by defining what are the common values between the religions, and let's create a shared interreligious educational program for shared values among religious communities. And this was a major achievement. It took 3 years of work, of negotiation, of patience, of dialogue among communities that was facilitated by Adyan Foundation. And by the end, we were able, in fact, to publish these educational resources and to make them available in schools, where now students are learning about their religion, but at the same time knowing that these values taught from a faith-based perspective are the same values, and that they are shared with the other students who have a different religious background. I will end here, finishing by saying that cultural and religious literacy, as I said at the beginning, it's a right for each human being today, especially for children, but also it's a need for sustainable peace in our world. Thank you.
Shukran, Fadi, my dear friend Fadi. It's wonderful to hear your 4 points, and I want to emphasize sort of this notion that we can't develop, of course, inclusive education if we don't have inclusive governance. So that's an important point. And of course, the theory of intercultural and of inclusion and intercultural and religious literacy based on experience and not just knowledge. So thank you for that emphasis. And we look forward to learning from Adyan's concrete example that you gave. And hopefully we can share it, translate it, and adapt it to other contexts in the world. Shukran. Thank you. I now move on to our fourth speaker, Dr. Samia Hook, who is an associate professor and interim dean of the School of Humanities and Social Science at Braku University in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Welcome with us, Dr. Hook, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Brodeur. And to all the panelists that we've just heard, thank you to Kaisid and the G20 for inviting me to this esteemed panel. This topic is something that I've been working on for the past couple of years, and my entry point is very much as a South Asian and as a Bangladeshi. Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country, but has struggled with its label secular, but would like to hold on to it. And there, increasingly over time, there seems to have been a paradox that's been presented, a conflict between the Muslim majoritarian identity pitted against the constitutional framing of the country as secular, and what would a secular ethos be for a country like Bangladesh. Now, our religious identity is intertwined with colonial and post-colonial history and our relationship with neighboring India, of course, and then afterwards with Pakistan. But we have actually, Bangladesh is known for a lot of progress in development sort of parameters and indexes we fared well on. So that's the story from Bangladesh. And that sort of leaves the question of, identity sort of subsumed within the larger question of socioeconomic development. However, we've also noticed that identity cannot always neatly be subsumed under the question of socioeconomic development or economic development. And we've seen in the last 20 years certain results or outcomes that were not expectations of or from a developing nation. So those are sort of the large kind of overviews that got me into this area. And thinking about religious literacy. So the content and quality of religious literacy are important, again, as I've just noticed, not only for the ways in which they shed light on religion's role in public life, but also for the ways in which progressive societies identify religious ideals and their relationship to reasonable pluralism. The question is no longer whether religion should be taught, but rather how it should be taught. A response to the how questions begins with a clear understanding of the crucial difference between the teaching of religion and teaching about religion. So, from examples from the West, actually, highlight some things that, are important if we are to keep this distinction in mind. They are, for example, that an institution's approach to religion be academic, not devotional, that the school strives for student awareness of religion, but does not profess student acceptance of any religion, so on and so forth, or press for student acceptance of any religion. Now, these points that stress on objectivity and distance also come with allegations. Religion, religious education, and the need for religious literacy are intertwined with culture, history, and politics in ways that the demands that religious literacy move away from teaching tradition, rituals, and religious laws towards religious interconnections with other social, political, and cultural aspects provide fertile battlegrounds for majoritarianism, sectarianism, and suspicions of forced secularization. The push away from tradition to something akin to the sociology of religion gives rise to the fear that religious values will be lost, that everything a certain people have fought to achieve will be taken away from them. This has led experts to ask, does the teaching of religion in public schools or elsewhere have to be detached of belief, or can belief exist and be nurtured in positive ways where one learns about one's own religion as well as those of others, where religion is a part of culture endowed with the historicity and dynamism that applies to other aspects of society too? In other words, where is lived religion? What would faith look like in this? What would it mean for religious literacy to be grounded in faith and interfaith perspectives and not solely in a secular humanistic one? The interfaith angle must mean that the idea of any religion as the best must be discarded as a starting premise for instruction in religious studies. So there are many ways in which the capacious possibilities of religious literacy can be assessed, and textbooks offer a window of understanding into what having dynamic faith may look like. In the context of Bangladesh, where I work, a Muslim-majority secular country, a collaborative research project undertaken by the Center for Peace and Justice at Brack University and the World Faiths Development Dialogue, housed in Georgetown University, on religious textbooks at the secondary level reveals that textbooks teach their own religions only, spend a lot of time training students in ritual observances, and do not fail to mention that each religious tradition is the best in the world. So other than this exclusivist approach to teaching for religion that dominates, there is a real dearth of any other experience that allows one to engage with the other through the themes of unity, cooperation, collaboration, and a wrestling with histories and politics that have been divisive. It is often the case that teachers are undertrained and religious studies is less prioritized to warrant the capacity development of religious teachers. So some piecemeal examples from across the world or across Asia are interesting. There are some examples from the Philippines, in Mindanao, in Manila, in Japan, in Korea, that basically highlight a deliberative process, a collaborative process, which allows for a consensus on spiritual and ethical foundations of peace education. Through continued workshops, continued engagement. So these examples shed light on the importance of partnerships and the need to move away from a siloed approach to religious education. Big and small examples can be picked up by policymakers to create greater coordination between religious actors, organizations, civil society platforms to assess what can be introduced and incorporated at the institutional level. In Bangladesh, although religious textbooks fall short of ideal tone and content, there are instances of religious organizations doing scriptural reasoning with young people, of universities working on the role of faith actors in development, and engaging students to reinterpret sites of worship from an interfaith perspective. These are experiential processes. Although these are sort of small approaches, they merit further light and consideration by policymakers. The roles played by universities brings me to my last, but certainly not least important point. Educators and religious actors who are already engaged in such work will provide invaluable support to the training of teachers, which is an essential component to transitioning from teaching for religion to religious literacy. Without adequate teachers and high-quality teacher training that aligns teacher preparation with desired outcomes of instruction in religious studies, initiatives will not be able to get off the ground. Finally, a question of the panelists prior to me had mentioned governance, the question of inclusive governance. There must be transparency and vetting around the curriculum and textbook writing process that determines how religion and ethics are taught in historically relevant, culturally sensitive, and humanistically capacious ways. Bringing in university educators, external experts, local religious actors, as well as education specialists, working with religious actors and grassroots organizations on the ground who engage not only in interfaith dialogue, but are also mobilized towards interfaith action. Building these coalitions openly and transparently will provide a good start process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samia Hook. It's a really important contribution of trying to understand sort of how religious education, religious literacy must be embedded in also learnings about culture, history, in particular colonial and post-colonial sort of dynamics and politics and economics today. And so thank you for raising this complexity and the challenge that it brings to training religious educators in this field to change the paradigm often at how we go about doing religious literacy so that it's more open and more inclusive as such, before we can talk about the general educational system as being also more inclusive. So thank you again for this important, nuanced contribution. I'd like now to move to our next speaker. Our fifth speaker is Dr. Muhammad Abderrahim, who is a lecturer at the University of Al-Azhar in Egypt. He also has important responsibilities in linking with the University of Erlangen and Münster in Germany for exchange programs, and is also a CAICID fellow. So the floor is yours, Dr. Abderrahim, who will be speaking in Arabic. أهلا وسهلا تفضلوا.
Thank you very much to Dr. Patrice Brodeur, and thank you very much also to CAICID for this very special chance to participate at the G20 Interfaith Forum. Furthermore, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, to the organizers of this very special forum, in spite of the difficulties due to COVID-19. Please let me point out give you a short overview of of Azhar, which is the oldest, as you might know, which is the oldest Sunni Islamic institution in the world. Also, it has different departments. It not only offers education, but also research, studies, dawah, Islamic studies. It has Islamic Research Academy, which is an academy conducting researches, revisions, translations of all books and reference material issued by the Azhar. And then fourthly, there is a special department for education of foreign scholars and students. We have about 40,000 students who come from more than 40 countries around the world. Furthermore, we also have the Azhar Observatory to fight extremism. We have the Azhar Center for Media and for Translation. Now, speaking about strategies and very modern or up-to-date initiatives provided by the Noble Azhar during the past years, especially while facing terroristic attacks, while facing extremism and extremist groups publishing false and misunderstandable interpretation of religious texts. So the Azhar, like many other religious institutions, was asked and was rather forced to deal with this threat, facing the whole world. So first of all, I think we need to find answers for these misunderstandings and misinterpretations of religious texts. Also, we need to stand up against hate speech, for instance, extremistic speech, especially on social media. Thirdly, we need to revise educational religious books and curricula. And fourthly, we need to modernize and also reform the educational curricula at the Azhar University and at all other universities. So in the past years, as I mentioned, the Azhar created the Azhar Observatory to fight extremism, as well as an online fatwa center within the years of 2015 and 16 in order to fight not only extremistic convictions, but also to fight and fight false fatwas and distribute right fatwas. Furthermore, the Azhar also issued a set of books, we call it the Islamic Culture, in order to stand up against extremistic ideas which might be propagated in schools or also amongst pupils, university students, etc. Therefore, these curricula comprise very modern understanding which weren't there in the traditional books of the Azhar University or other religious institutions. We spoke about, in these modernized books, we spoke about diversity, respecting the other, citizenship, pluralism, tolerance, peace, social cooperation, religious cooperation. So here, the Azhar University tries to find the link between the worldly issues and religious issues. So this new subject we have at schools and at universities named religious culture. Now, it's not only a subject named religion, but religious culture also comprises problems which people might face in their everyday lives. Then Islamic culture would also tend to issues like jihad, expiation, governorship, caliphate, and also the real understanding or the correct understanding of the hijra, of migration in Islam, of atheism, of the curricula would also clearly inhibit and clearly prevent all endeavors striving against the selves, but would rather call to strive against desires, against the devil, for instance, but would clearly state that no one in the world, no other person should be declared as an atheist or as an unbeliever. Now, the books of this Islamic culture subject has a whole chapter in regard to dialogue, in regard of the ethics of dialogue, in regard to citizenship, as I said, to correct understanding of Islam, and clearly declares that citizenship, common citizenship, is one of the pillars of Islam, and that it's not about religion if you live in one homeland. It's more about citizenship, it's more about the love for your homeland, and accordingly it's about Islam and the tolerance of Islam towards others, towards other believers. And here we especially concentrate on dramatic stories or on narratives. For instance, we have a TV program where you see a family of father, mother, and two children sitting in front of their TV and watching the news. And on the news, you have the breaking news that terrorists attacked a tourist bus and tourists were killed. So we start off with the mother saying that this is a crime, the father saying that this is a crime, that Islam does not allow such crimes. Then you have the children asking questions, and the parents responding that all religions would incriminate such attacks. So what I wanted to say, that we, as I had mentioned before, we try to concentrate on a dramatic storytelling narrative. I would like to go into more detail, but as we have time constraints, so I only wanted to give a short overview of the last endeavors of the Azhar. Thank you very much for your... Thank you.
Shukran jazilan, Dr. Abdurrahim.
Thank you very much, Dr.
I particularly appreciate your examples given from Al-Azhar on this challenges around textbooks and a process of transforming curricula towards more open, diverse, and inclusive elements and that's obviously a long-term process, and we can talk more about that in the following exchange. So thank you. I move to our next speaker, and it is Professor Priyankar Upadhyay, and he comes from India. He lives in India, and he's UNESCO Chair for Peace and Intercultural Understanding at Paranas Hindu University. It's a pleasure to have you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petrus. It's really for somebody who works through the interreligious understanding and culture as a matter of peace. It's so exciting to join this G20 Interfaith Forum. I mean, these issues were in the past, they were very rare. Rarely you have such issues being joined together by scholars and activists. So it's very nice to see the questions of inclusive approaches to community leaders, how they transform curricula, etc., coming on the fore, which is a marker of a change. I think globally there is a realization that on the name of secular understanding, we cannot do away with religious impulses. And I think this is where I would like to begin. Now, a lot of ground has already been covered by my fellow speakers, and very profound ideas have been exchanged. And I'll just start with the very first speaker who made a very telling remark that what shapes education? I mean, there's a dilemma. What shapes what? Society shapes education, or it is the other round. And I think this is a key point when we consider, say, the countries like India, or I think elsewhere, the question of governance. The question is where exactly the people and the state and the leaders want us to go. And I think where we need to really emphasize much on saying that interreligious understanding, intercultural education, for instance, is key not only to peace but also to sustainable development. And I think this job is very well being articulated by the United Nations. I would remain rather confined to the Indian experience, which is, of course, a very large population, but also uh, multiple ideas, some of those very founding ideas about education as transformation. And one can talk, one has to start with Mahatma Gandhi, who believed that education is transformation. And he believed, especially coming to this particular issue of inclusive approaches and finding examples, Gandhi had a simple wisdom. He would say that the children education must include teaching of their own religions. And he picks up this point very smartly, because what is happening this part of the world is that people tend to know more about other religions, and that knowledge mostly comes through distorted images circulated on social media and all kind of propaganda. They don't know that there are elements of peace building in their own religion. So that Gandhi used to talk very, very poignantly about it, the importance of teaching your own religion to your pupil. And this religion was at least not simply confined to the text or the scriptures. It was also probably more about religion as a social practice. So, in that sense, I think if we need to, whenever we talk about education as transformation and using these trajectories at the school level, we must talk about looking at the dynamic experiences of society and how these dynamic experiences can be inculcated in our curricula. And I think a lot of these ideas are being sort of used and very effectively by the sages, by very interesting examples, and the names are far too many to miss. But say, for example, sages like Sai Baba, sages like even Ravi Shankar, etc. They have talked about inclusive, education that includes examples from other religions. The important thing I think that is happening in countries like India is that we do not have much patience for teaching religion or including religious histories or comparative religions or history of religion to our young students. I mean, one of the doctorate research that was conducted in my UNESCO center came, and the research explored all the forms of educational institutions for children, including the Hindu Gurukul system of education, the Islamic madrasas, and the denominational schools by Christians, and what kind of religious teaching are being imparted. I think the experiences were far too diverse to really conceptualize, but one thing that came to us very clearly was that the religion is taught very minimally at the early stages. I mean, for instance, till class 3 or 4, there is no teaching of religion as such. Thereafter, cautiously you talk about Buddha or Jainism, etc., etc. But what is happening, I think, is that as probably the chair also mentioned, that this curricula and the textbooks are also being disused for a variety of purposes, and a part of it was also by my counterpart from Bangladesh. So I think if one has to really talk about the putting in this interreligious formats or frames into education for transformation, one could also very conveniently use examples from such syncretic or such inclusive religious practices like Sufi tradition, Bhakti tradition, and this can also be done in informal manner. I think it is very important for us not to simply mainstream these inclusive ideas, bringing all religion into one frame, but also I think more important is to use informal occasions, this informal teaching, the workshops, the extracurricular activities. They are very helpful in telling our young minds about the rituals which are shared by all religious communities, the diversity through music, and also probably the global commons like environment. So, a variety of ways we can do that. I think that, but the moot question, as I said earlier, is do we really want to do it? Because all said and done, the government and the state policies, they have a very strong role to play in terms of framing the curricula and so on and so forth. There is not as much of autonomy, there is not as much of freedom to do so. And at the end, I would say there is also this question of that, the question of quality education, which I think is the forefront of the mentions and others. So this quality education is amiss among the young students. And also you cap it with the problematic of digital divide. So in all, we need to provide quality education which caters to the need of today's job market. At the same time, the global citizenry concept and the inclusiveness also has to be brought in. Some of the ideas that I thought I can just join this particular panel with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Priyankar Upadhyaya. And I appreciate in particular sort of understanding sort of that if we want to talk about quality education, then it needs to include sort of religious literacy in an inclusive way. And that is an important element. And also, of course, the challenges of working with government in making those changes possible. And so we'll talk more about this because, of course, this whole forum is about linking to policymakers in government. So thank you for your contributions and your perspective. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to our next speaker, and it's Professor Tom Banchoff from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who is Vice President for Global Engagement. The floor is yours, Professor Banchoff.
Thank you very much, Patrice. I'm delighted to be here, and I also want to thank Kaisid and the other organizers for hosting this critically important conversation, and also to recognize my colleague, Catherine Marshall at Georgetown, for her contributions to the vital work of the G20 Interfaith Forum. I think everyone will agree this has been an excellent conversation so far, and I think it's fitting that we focused on proven examples of inclusive education and religious literacy. Examples of where this work has succeeded, of how it might be scaled to the national or even the international level. But in my 5 minutes, I want to focus a little bit on why this scaling is inevitably very difficult and suggest one modest possible way forward. So the first most obvious obstacle to scaling best practices in this area has been mentioned, and it's really the lack of religious literacy among teachers at all levels. They may, in some cases, know their own tradition well, but they rarely grasp others. So teacher training is critical, and in its absence, I think you'll agree, no other educational policies can really have an impact. But there's a second, equally formidable obstacle, I think, to scaling best practices in inclusive education and religious literacy. And that is the political character of religion. I'm a political scientist, so I try to think about this very complex topic. But it begins with the intuition I think we all share that because religion commands people's loyalties and passions, as it must, it is also a powerful social and ultimately political force. And so even teachers and education officials find it difficult to be both sensitive and objective about different traditions, what they have in common, where they differ. And of course, religions do differ in important ways. On top of this, teachers and education officials from the school to the ministerial level inevitably face pressures from their political contexts. For example, in regimes where the free exercise of religion is not guaranteed, or in countries where the majority tradition exerts social or political pressures in the educational sphere. And we've heard a couple of examples so far in the conversation. So where does this leave us? Well, even if the first obstacle is overcome, if we improve religious literacy among teachers, The second obstacle, the politicization of religion, will persist in the inevitable biases of those same teachers and in the layers of governance above them, from the bureaucrats who approve textbooks to the national leaders who may seek to manipulate or sometimes even repress religion in a country for their own political ends. Now, I said I'd try to end on a positive note. Well, looking forward, again, I think we can agree that every effort should be made to support teacher training and thoughtful textbook policies, and we've heard some very good examples. Every effort in these areas, despite the inevitable obstacles. But I want to make another modest suggestion at the international level in the context of forums like the G20, and that is a plea for the promotion of the teaching of core texts that highlight commonalities across traditions. So not entire curricula, but certain key texts that could be folded flexibly into different classes for as little as a day in a given year. I'm thinking, for example, of the letter of Muslim scholars directed toward the Christian world, A Common Word Between Us and You from 2007, with its emphasis on the shared centrality of love of God and love of neighbor in both traditions and indeed in many other traditions. Or we have a promising recent example, the Declaration on Human Fraternity, signed by Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in February of last year. Now, neither document is perfect, but both stand out as eloquent statements of commonalities between the two largest religious communities on the planet, and there are many other statements encompassing many other traditions that one might draw on. So just imagine, for example, just take the example of the Declaration on Human Fraternity being taught and discussed simultaneously around the world. Envision lively conversations in classrooms and on Zoom within and across countries. I think that through private philanthropy and with the public support of religious leaders across traditions, one could support the development of short one-page lesson plans, have to be practical, one-page lesson plans about a given text in multiple languages as part of an invitation to teachers, schools, and school systems, or maybe even at the level of the G7 or the G20. This would be an invitation not to disrupt or overhaul existing curricula, but to integrate one or more core texts, if only for an hour or two, into classes as part of a global conversation. Now, this is a modest suggestion, very difficult to achieve, of course, but still modest and no replacement for the hard work of identifying and scaling best practices in inclusive education and religious literacy through teacher training, textbook review, and other avenues. But I think its impact could be significant, and perhaps it's something worth exploring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate this modest suggestion, which I think is not difficult to do from the perspective of developing the one-page plans, but it is the broader sort of, to which audiences do you then deliver those plans that might be much more demanding in time and energy and resources of all kinds. But it is a wonderful suggestion, and it will certainly be passed on in the process of gathering more recommendations from our conversations together in these panels to the process of eventually sort of bringing this up to the leaders of the G20 in some shape or form. So thank you again, Tom, for this contribution in particular. I'd like to move on to the next speaker now. Our next to last speaker is Ambassador David Fernandez Puyana, who is based in Geneva, and he's the permanent observer at the United Nations University for Peace. Por favor, a usted.
Gracias. First of all, I would like to thank CAICID, the UN Alliance of Civilizations, and the government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for inviting us, the University for Peace, to participate in this panel about education, religious literacy, and cultural diversity. The G20's leaders' statements begin with saying that the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic is a powerful reminder of our interconnectedness and vulnerabilities. Humanity, everybody is aware about it, is facing a global crisis of such magnitude that we don't have a record of the broad impact the COVID pandemic is generating in all the areas. the pandemic has brought about essential change in health, economy, production, trade, and relations in the international system and between the major powers. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most dangerous challenges this world has ever faced. But one question I would like to raise is what are the changes that the academy has taken to adapt before the COVID-19 pandemic? The lack of presence education has led to a change in a digital educational field. In a short period of time, computers, social networks, and applications have invaded the academic spaces. We have turned out houses into learning centers. Both teachers and students have learned how better communicating academic content. For this, the support of families and an adaptation of the educational policies of the countries have been essential to achieve an optimal outcome. But the main risks for the post-COVID-19 pandemic could be the increase of supremacist attitudes and the exploitation of hate speech against vulnerable groups and peoples. In order to combat the consequence derived from the COVID-19 pandemic, it's vital to promote the right to education, the intercultural dialogue, and the cooperation among the peoples. But what are the priorities for the G20 leaders for education as a part of the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis from all perspectives, all human perspectives? First of all, it's to overcome the negative side of digital technology. We should recall to remember in 2019, the 80% of the industrialized population used the internet, while only 19% in the less developed countries access technology tools. This situation has created exclusion and inequality in education, impeding the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 4, which aims to achieve quality education for all by 2013. Second, we need to break barriers and allow the globalization of education imposed on us by COVID-19 in order to democratize the acknowledgement. Digital technology needs to promote the online teaching in order to reach all regions of it, offering opportunities to academics and students regardless of age, sex, or cultural level. And the third and last is then to combat the discrimination and racism in the educational field. Education should be directed to the full development of the human personality and the respect of all human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. For this reason, the right to education is the best way to combat intolerance and hatred. Thank you very much for the organizer for this opportunity.
Muchísimas gracias, Embajador Fernández Poyana. I'm really delighted that you brought up an important element about sort of the importance of addressing hate speech, of addressing racism, and you named the names very directly, and they have to be, because they are in the midst of many places in our societies, including, of course, the new virtual spaces. You've raised the question and the challenge of internet access, and I'd like to come back to that point in a few minutes when we are done with our speakers. There's one more to go. So thank you again, Ambassador, for your wonderful and concise presentation. I would like to turn to our last guest presenter, and this is Dr. Wendy Yi, who helped to participate and collate recommendations from a variety of different groups that met on last Thursday, October 8th, virtually, of course, from different parts of the world. There were over 200 participants, both CAICID fellows as well as representatives of various youth organizations or youth branches of interreligious dialogue organizations. And so Dr. Yi wonderfully combined sort of and brought out of those multiple recommendations on different topics related to G20, those that specifically relate to education. And so the floor is yours, Dr. Wendy.
Thank you very much, Professor Patrice. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So on behalf of the G20 CAICID Fellows and youth organizations pre-G20 Interfaith Forum, I would like to present some challenges related to education, religious literacy among the youth and women, and also to share some key recommendations proposed by the working group members. I think some of these challenges have been mentioned by our panelists earlier. So I would like to echo some of these challenges again we have discussed in our working groups. Now, the first challenge is many religious studies taught at religious schools are dogmatic rather than academic in nature. Hence, the youth miss out on the multifaceted understanding of diversity and inclusion. And this has resulted in prejudice, stereotyping, and hatred between people of different religion. And the second challenge is the lack of collaboration between religious leaders, NGOs, and the education sectors to support or promote multi-religious and multicultural education. And the third challenge are women have often been excluded from interreligious dialogue because of their social status of not being equal to men. As such, to tackle these challenges, these are our recommendations. Firstly, to include religious studies in a more academic manner in the curriculum of both private and public schools and universities. Secondly, to promote multi-religious and multicultural education through collaboration between various religious leaders, NGOs, and the education sectors. Thirdly, to create and to ensure that women and youth have a platform where they can be justly represented, where they can enter into dialogue and have their voices heard through perhaps, a summit like a World Youth Summit, which can be organized by CAICID and United Nations, or to declare 2020 to 2030 an international decade for women empowerment. Finally, to include both formal and informal learning opportunities through collaboration and constructive partnership between religious institutions, NGOs, and governmental organizations in order to increase both intra and inter-religious literacy among the youth and women. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yi. It's really very important to respect and to integrate as much as we can those practical recommendations that have come from youth and fellows last week. And so thank you for being here with us, sort of helping us to include that in what we move forward ourselves at this panel. I'd like now to open up first, as part two of this particular panel, I'd like to open up the space for the panelists to react to each other for about 10 minutes or so, 10-15 minutes, before we leave the rest of the time to then address the many questions that have come up already through the chat space from the general participants. So first, I want to invite Dr. Sultan, whom I know has already communicated with me because he has a question, I think, in reaction to listening to Professor Fadidau's presentation. So, Dr. Sultan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrice. Thank you very much, Professor Patrice Bruder. Let me thank and express my gratitude to all speakers, to all participants for this very valuable information and for sharing, especially sharing your experience from your activities. When listening to Reverend Professor Fadi Daw when speaking about the book which was issued from Adyan Foundation, and I'd like to express my respect and thanks to Adyan Foundation regarding the common grounds of Islam and Christianity. And here I think this is a very important issue, because we were speaking about religious literacy, which is a major issue for me, especially in regard to the new generation, who often have very stigmatized pictures of other cultures, other religions, or they might even carry in themselves pictures which are wrong of the other or which are not complete. Therefore, I think we really need to concentrate and focus more on religious illiteracy. Please let me also comment on another issue, and I think which was mentioned by Professor Thomas Bancho from Georgetown University, who spoke about training the trainer, training the religious leadership, and also including the various understandings in curricula. But nevertheless, I think that training the trainer and training religious leaders would be a good basis to disseminate the correct understanding of religion. And here I say that I often live that trainers are trained or religious leaders are trained, but the training is very theoretical. They do not go into detail, they do not go into practice. So I'd really prefer to have a training which would comprise trainers or religious leaders from other religions, for instance, in order to allow religious leaders from different faiths to exchange views, to discuss. I think at least in our part of the world, in the Arab world, we lack such discussion. Such discussions, may they be panel discussions, and we also lack a practical form of curricula for training the trainers, for training religious leadership, because, as I said, we tend to only concentrate or focus on the theory. Thirdly, I'd like to comment on another issue in regard to diversity. What I watched is that religious leaders or also religious teachers often lack an understanding of diversity or don't regard diversity as a major characteristic of our lives. Therefore, I think that religious institutions and FOBs need to look into diversity as not only being a matter of human rights, but also a matter of education. Because if we have pupils in schools, if we have classes, if we have universities comprising different nations, comprising or accepting different religions, different backgrounds, different cultures, we need, as religious leaders, to look into diversity on practical ground. So I think looking at curriculars and at diversity on a practical level is very important. Also, development, like my colleague here from the Azhar University said, developing up-to-date curricula. This is all what I wanted to mention for now, but maybe there would be a possibility to comment more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sultan. I don't know if Professor Dao wants to respond, and others as well afterwards.
Okay, I was moved. Just to say thanks for Dr. Sultan and to confirm also something he said about the importance of also a diverse audience in training and in collaborating and working together. This is based on our daily experience in Adyan Foundation. The trainings, the educational programs are always much more rich when the audience and the trainees are from different backgrounds also, because as I shared, one of my points was the third point in my presentation, how we should make from this type of training or education by itself an intercultural and interreligious experience where people meet each other and build relation and know how to build relation, learn how to build relation with each other. And my last maybe point I would like to add to the discussion, because we are speaking positively from the perspective of cultural and religious literacy, but I'm sure you are all aware the other side of the reality, the rise of hate speech nowadays, of polarizations and societies, of discriminations and so on, and mainly hate speech is a big challenge, and it's a common, I think, challenge on the global level. And here my note is not to forget the role of media and social media in education as educational tool, not just as media outlets, but media and social media today play a huge role in informing the knowledge and the attitudes of our people. And I think we have lots to do also from an educational perspective in the digital world, and especially with the COVID-19 experience. I think it showed us that there is a huge gap, not only in online education and online resources, but also in the whole online communication spectrum. I would say there is a huge lack about the right literacy, the needed literacy about culture, religions, and intercultural and interreligious relations. This is what we are trying also to fill this gap through an experience that we launched in Adyan called Ta'addudiyya, which is a platform for the Arab world to spread the knowledge of this diversity and to make available resources, digital resources in Arabic for all people. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dahl. I also see a policy coming out of this, which is indicating the links and trying to get the ministries of education to connect sort of those who do media literacy with those who do religious literacy. And some examples could be around precisely sort of exercises that try to bring out from the students themselves the discovery of some of these declarations that Professor Banchoff has mentioned earlier. So thank you to both of you. Other reactions that you may have. I think I see Dr. Gill. Go ahead. Okay. So I don't know where Dr. Gill has. Well, I know exactly where she is in the United Kingdom, but she's not yet back online. And so hopefully she will come back in a few seconds. In the meantime, others may have questions to ask each other or respond to. Yes, Dr. Mohammed Abdurrahim, تفضلوا.
Yes, thank you, Professor Patrice. I would like to point out that it is important to take care of dialogue of civilizations and its impact on the educational process. And I stress out the point of Dr. Samia Haq and Dr. Wendy May that there are religious contents or sociological concepts that are looked upon or perceived in a false manner. And Dr. Wendy mentioned that one of the negative aspects of religious education that it has had for a long time been not included in the academic field but perceived as another topic. And so we need, through the dialogue of civilizations, that the religious curricula and religious teaching can benefit from the progress of other civilizations when it comes to research, when it comes to critical thinking curriculums and processes. And I think this is one of the positive ideas of dialogue of civilizations, which shouldn't stay in closed rooms and in workshops and in conferences, but should be implemented on the academic religious teachings and curricula through the international accords, especially between universities, especially between the universities regarding religious education. Thank you.
Thank you, Shukran, for those more specific recommendations. I'd like now to turn to Dr. Chateau Gill.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful.
Thank you. I want to ask our distinguished panelists about the connection between two things. The first one is especially for people like Fadi, but also Tom, who have studied religion from political perspective. Think about the transcendent dimension. We tend to see religion from, if we go inside religion, people would say religion is about transcendent dimension of human experience. Maybe the education of and from religion is to enrich that spiritual religious life, which constitutes human well-being. So that's one dimension. The other side is, I think the India perspective, and also the Bangladeshi, and of course other example. Tom yourself talked about that the religion is, in fact, the study of religion is actually to contribute to the values-based dimension of our practice. But there is a question: is value, are values taught? Especially when we talk about, Samia talk about the inclusive governance and so on. No, I mean Fadi talk about inclusive governance. All values are caught in the sense that you see in the lived experience, lived processes, that we live out those values, those beautiful things that make humanity we are. So one is, where is the transcendent dimension when we talk about religion? We seem to only talk about religion from outside of it. The other is, if religion ultimately is also about human values, and where is the values-based dimension in our education, but also in our communal life? Thank you.
Anybody wants to respond to Dr. Gill? Yes, Priyanka. Yes, Dr. Paraya.
Well, very poignant queries and very helpful also to understand our own approach to the problematic. I mean, I can talk a little bit about the Indian experience and probably in other societies as well. That in India, drawing from, as I mentioned, Mahatma Gandhi and quite a good number of philosophers and sages, we developed a sense that spiritualism could be one mode. Spiritual commonality between different religious traditions and practices could be used as a frame and as a form of value education. And for many years past, I think many curricula development exercises have tried to include value education, which is not exactly about one single religion, but about different religious traditions and the convergence around common global commons, for instance. But this is fraught with contentions because oftentimes even an innocent suggestions about some value is seen as political. So I think overall, I think many speakers today have talked about the political trajectories of religion and how religious ideas are used. So value education is there. Value education must be there, and but then like the other aspect, as I mentioned, the political dimension has to be kept in mind. I mean, how do you come to certain political consensus? Thank you.
Thank you. Did I see anybody else wanting to react? I think I can see the nonverbal of Dr. Samia. There we go. Okay. Samia, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I think at the risk of sort of being or sounding circular, I think, value-based education, whose value, what values, and, is something that we debate unendingly, right? And there's so many fault lines in that why is this value that we need to favor or privilege over other values. I think what Professor Gill pointed out is, sort of the transcendent dimension of religion, right? And values emanating from that, sort of like the spiritual value, a core spiritual value, which is extremely meditative, it's contemplative, right? And in that, it's not necessarily religious praxis, which could bode very well for traditional societies because, as my counterpart from India pointed out, there are lots of very interesting syncretistic ways in which communities and religious traditions have coexisted and lived aside one another. However, there is also a tendency to see sort of the quest for spirituality over ritual and practice as a secular ploy to take one's sort of habitual grounding away. So I think we probably are in agreement in this room, but I think the question, for this forum is to help us determine how we can get these really complex and tricky issues and very deep, thoughtful issues that are not devoid of how we've done these things in history before. I think our historical traditions, even within South Asia, I think my colleague from India would agree, there are plenty of good examples that we can pick up on. And ignore the ones that insist on practice and dogma and ritual. Not that rituals are bad, but how are we going to approach this tricky condition in a way that it goes outside this safe space to religious actors, to religious communities, to teachers, to policymakers even. I know my experience from Bangladesh is that who writes the textbook, who gets picked to write the textbook is a highly political question, right? So I think I would really welcome, if not today, but moving forward from this forum, some guidelines, some working groups, some intra-country collaborations, unified collaborations perhaps, to think about ways in which we could actually do this work and not just speak about it.
Thank you. And I have here a practical suggestion, and we'll add it to our online resources coming out of this particular conference. Kaisid has worked with UNESCO on developing guidelines on diversity in helping those who actually write the textbooks, guiding them on how to better include different notions of identity diversity. So not just religious diversity, but gender and nationality, language, ethnicity, etc. And so some of those tools do exist, and I'll make sure that it is added on our website for that purpose to respond to that request. So thank you. Given the time left, I'd like to now move to opening up to respond to questions that have come or almost flooded our chat space, which is a wonderful example of how much listening has taken place by our different listeners and online participants. And I would like to thank you all for doing that, adding your questions and comments. Again, in the 20 minutes or so left, there won't be time to address all, but let me begin and immediately ask a question that comes from Sayyid Al-Amin, a religious leader in Lebanon, a senior religious leader in Lebanon, who basically says, you know, how do you actually transform the religious education at a national level when the current situation is that religious education is done by actually having the kids separate, you know, at the time of that particular class, the Muslims go into a separate classrooms and the Christians go into different classrooms, and yet, you know, there's a need to somehow overcome that because you're teaching them separation rather than unity. How to go about addressing such changes, and I'm particularly interested in if you have a magic sort of recipe for changing those in power within ministries of education in trying to figure out how to convince them to make those changes. Thank you. And it could be, this case comes out of Lebanon, but of course the situation of my broader question applies to many countries around the world. So who wants to go forth addressing Said Al-Amin's question?
If you allow, Patrice.
Yes, please. It makes sense for you to begin. Yes.
To add very brief comments on this very important question, in fact, and that is taking us back to the question of, or to the dimension, political dimension of education, including religious education. When we speak about formal education, we are speaking about curriculum, we are speaking about the responsibility of the government, and then, of course, we would be speaking about how the ruler, how the governments can use also religion and religions, you know, to let's say sustain or foster their own political power in society. So this is a very complex question, and since I'm speaking from Lebanon, I know also how much it's complex, and it can have also some counter effects on what is meant to be. Having said this, I would like to add that we should be able to distinguish between confessional, you know, religious education, where, and I think here we should add, but not only here, this transcendental dimension that was mentioned by Professor Sherto, also Professor Phil, but not only here, I think, and the religious and cultural literacy, which is, I called it, to be a right for children, where we are approaching this diversity from a more cultural perspective, making people learn and recognize this beauty of diversity, to be able to celebrate this diversity. This should also include a spiritual or transcendental dimension, but in a more interreligious or interfaith setting, which is, I think, we are not at all prepared to be able to do it in schools. It requires, and I'm sure the panelists know what I mean, lots of not only formation for teachers and educators, but also attitudes that make them able, you know, to be at the same time equidistant from the different spiritual experiences of the, for example, of the students in the class, and valuing these different spiritual and religious experiencing, and making the students themselves recognize this diversity as a richness, which is very challenging task that we are speaking about. It's possible. We should be able to do it. We should put it as a target, but at the same time, we should recognize that the way is very long. So between having a confessional education within schools that is dividing exactly students, as it happens in Lebanon, based on their religious backgrounds, into subclasses, and each of them will be taught its own, his or her own religion. This is a scenario that I don't think this is the best scenario, but it exists even. Let me give the example of Germany, for example, where confessional education also is possible within schools and so many other countries. Yet it has to be balanced with the religious and cultural literacy education, and at the same time ensuring that the confessional education is not being sectarian, or it's not including discriminations or exclusivist attitude vis-a-vis others, which is not easy, because here we have also the four rights, the religious freedom right and educating about religion's right, yet controlled, because we are speaking about a governance for this. So the role of the government and the decision makers and policy makers to ensure that there is no discrimination even within a confessional religious education. I will stop here because this is very long and complex, I think, discussion, but just to share these elements, for the reflection.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Fadi. Unless there's a burning sort of person who wants to continue on this, I'd like to move to another questions. We have only about 5 minutes left. Unfortunately, I miscalculated myself the time. I guess I missed out on learning moderator skills better when it comes to time management. But there we go. It's a question from Reverend Dr. Udo from Nigeria, who is asking, basically, what would the panelists suggest when a poor country like Nigeria is educating for survival, and that education implies struggling with conflicts within sort of the school systems and so on and so forth, or even having access to the school system? And so how does one then sort of make the changes necessary to have inclusive education when survival is really the primary focus given to education in poor countries? Difficult question. Yes, Tom.
Yeah, that's a very difficult and deep question. Just one angle on it. It's a good reminder that as we think about religious literacy in schools, there are many other more foundational questions that countries are facing. Getting children into school, and let's not forget that once you're in school, priority has to go to basic skills, literacy, not religious literacy, numeracy, basic technological skills, social studies, maybe as part of social studies, religious literacy. So let's just be aware of how many hours there are in the day, and of these other priorities as we think about how best to infuse the study of one's own tradition and other traditions going forward.
Thank you. I may add, it also has to do with the ethos of a school, in how you shape the relationship between the children and between the different teachers and the administrators and the staff, so that they actually together sort of have a sense of their own diversity and come together, in addition to the classroom time, which is of course very limited, as you've mentioned. Diversity has many angles to it, and that also broader understanding of diversity is necessary, especially in societies or in school contexts where, religiously speaking, it's relatively homogenous. There isn't that much diversity. So how do you bring diversity of a religion, for example, or diversity of culture when it's mostly one ethnic group in the classroom or in the school? So again, there are ways to go about it, but it's a different strategy, a different pedagogical strategy to use. And so there are, again, sort of different challenges there. I'd like to end with simply a question that comes from Asma. So thank you. She raised the question right early on about sort of how do we connect institutions for those of us in the listening mode of this panel that are listening to all of your suggestions and recommendations, and how do we link those recommendations to our own institutions? Are there particular websites or things that are more particularly useful that you would recommend at this point for us to be able to bring down sort of those recommendations to our local level? So thank you, Asma, for asking that question. I'll begin simply by saying, of course, there are policy briefs as well as further resources that are coming out of these panel discussions when they are mentioned, which we will add to the website of the G20 Interfaith Forum. So that's one space. I also know that UNESCO has an incredibly valuable and rich intercultural dialogue site that is a huge amount of resources available there. Other examples you may know of to finish? Adyan, of course, has many resources. And maybe also in India with the UNESCO chair. Yes, you can do self-promotion.
The thing is that most of these narratives and questions are so culture specific. I mean, what applies in case of, say, South Asia may not be as good for Nigeria or Sub-Saharan or any other part. Having said that, I think I personally experienced the richness of intercultural dialogue resources in UNESCO, which combined with a new thing that's happening. I just want to put it on board. I think everybody knows it. The media and information literacy and intercultural dialogue, MILID as they call it. So this is yet another forum which kind of provides very rich resources and relevant ideas which are being fleshed here. Just this.
Great, thank you. Excellent suggestion. We'll find this link and actually add it. Yes, Dr. Sultan.
Thank you very much. Let me only comment on the question how to link the recommendations of such a forum to religious institutions. I think this is a problem we do have and we face because we have hundreds or thousands of institutions working on the dialogue between religions, interreligious dialogue, on intercultural dialogue, but many times we don't find these institutions accomplishing each other. Also, we often do not have a kind of mechanism which would guarantee that these resources really reach the institutions. So I'd wish that a great organization like CAICID, for instance, would take up the role and take up the responsibility to guarantee that such resources, such recommendations would reach all religious institutions. Of course, we have many publications, but it might be hard to put our hands on these publications, or it might be hard to send those publications to those who need it. So maybe CAICID could be our kind mediator and take up the role of providing such resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the most complete and immediate recommendation that we can follow up on at CAICID. So thank you, Dr. Sultan, for the suggestion. I'd like to now move to the closure of our wonderful, rich panel together. I'd like to thank, of course, all and every speaker for your contributions. They were important, meaningful, and often very practical with specific examples, which of course bring out what Dr. Priyanka has mentioned is the specificity of each of our contexts. And how important it is to be respectful of that, to learn from each other, but constantly adapt to our local situations and needs. I'd like to thank, of course, the listeners, the participants, both those who've contributed something in the chat room, and my apology to those who asked questions and we were not able to address them. But nevertheless, I will take note of them and see if anything is valuable in terms of the process of reaching recommendations to the leaders of the G20 later on. Finally, I'd like to thank the organizers of this panel, in particular Reverend Mike Waltner and Marlene Rabel, who have been invaluable in making sure that the technology and the preparations for this panel were possible. Many thanks to both of you. And finally, I'd like to also thank the participants who were not here, most likely, at least not in the visual part of our exchange, that are part of the working group on education, which will continue in the years to come. And so if any of you are actually working in this field and are interested in joining an ongoing process of consultation when it comes to G20 over time, in matters of education, to make sure that some of these recommendations that we've brought out this year actually get some, track, practically speaking, over time, then please contact me or Kaisid or any of the four organizing organizations of this joint G20 Interfaith Forum. On that note, thanks again to all of you, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day or night, wherever you are on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice, and thanks to all of our esteemed panelists today. This is the conclusion of today's session, but we do encourage you to go to the live chat where there is a link to an evaluation. We would like to have your feedback on the panel today. And please do join us tomorrow for day 4 of the conference, which will open with a plenary on religious action to address threats of climate change. Goodbye.